Hey, I'm here to do a quick video on Pioneer talking about Phoenix and the Lotus Field matchup with Phoenix. I wanted to do this because I feel this is the matchup where I see the most confusion and misconceptions about. I often hear people say it's a really bad matchup. Um, it's and it just I don't really agree with that. It's not really my experience. I I've been doing some coaching recently, so I was watching other people play Phoenix, and I kind of picked up on why I think people have such a hard time against Lotus Field playing Phoenix. And the first thing I would say is it's about like playing against combo decks. I noticed that a lot of people when I was watching them play is every turn they just hold up counter spells and they never develop their own plan. Like it'll be turn one and they have Spell Pierce in their hand, and they'll have like a sleight of hand or a tap land, like a Jwari, or back when there's Spike Field was a better example even. And they would just be like, oh, I need to hold a Spell Pierce. What if they have Sylvan Scrying? And then it's like turn two, and they're like, oh, they can play Ledger Shredder, but they're like, well, if I play Ledger, they can resolve Sylvan Scrying. And then it's turn three, and they're like, oh, I could play pieces, but I need to hold up a counter. And like literally every turn, they just passes mana up. And yeah, if you pass with mana up and never cast any spells, you're not going to win a game of Magic. So it just kind of came down to a traditional fundamental playing against combo decks where you want to hold up mana so they don't, kill you, so you have interaction, but you need to develop your own game plan. And I would say basically the most important thing to know against combo decks is to know like when you're allowed to push pressure, be aggressive, and when you have to play defensive. I remember when I was growing up playing Legacy, I would always hear Storm players say like they always felt the biggest mistake their opponents would make is their opponents would just pass with mana every turn and never do anything. And they thought if their opponents played like that, they could, easily win. But they were always really scared of their opponents jamming threats. And so I think that's kind of like in general Magic, people when they play against combo, they kind of think, oh, the threats aren't great. I just need interaction, so I'm going to hold up interaction. But the threats can be very good against combo decks because combo decks don't have a lot of interaction for threats. So when you jam a threat against the combo deck, they have to execute their game plan or else the threat can keep generating value against them, and then the disruption that goes with that threat is good. I'm not sure how abstract that was, but basically what I was just trying to say was it's really important to know when you can just jam your threats first combo because they can be defenseless. They have very few interaction. But it's also very important to know when you have to slow down and interact, because if you do that wrong, you instantly die. And it's kind of interesting because when you can imagine, so it was the Spell Pierce example, what I was saying, you can imagine that some Lotus Field hands are very dependent on Sylvan Scrying. If you counter the Sylvan Scrying, their hand might not function. When Lotus Field doesn't have Lotus Field, the deck doesn't function very well. So you might think, well, if I, cast my card now and then they resolve Scrying, then the Spell Pierce will be useless later because the Lotus Field makes so much mana or whatever. I guess the real tension there is that it feels like both your options are bad. It feels like if you try to tap out now, them getting Lotus Field means you lose, but if you pass, then at least that won't happen. But the problem there is, I would just kind of think on the aggregate about possible plays your opponents could make. So for example, if your plan is like, I'm going to hinder my own development so I could try and counter Sylvan Scrying, well, what if they just, have an impulse, which they can cast at instant speed? What if they just draw a Lotus Field naturally? All those situations are generating situations where you're falling behind. And then you have to ask, how bad is it really when they Sylvan Scrying? Like, they could just draw Lotus Field naturally. They don't need a tutor for it. And then you can realize, like, oh, if I just, play my Shredder on turn 2, play my pieces on turn 3, then, like, turn 4, turn 5, when they're going to kill me, then I can use my Spell Pierce to disrupt them. And since I've already developed my board, then I'll be in a much better position. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I try usually not to fight over their mana that much in the early game, and I try to more put myself in a strong position. I feel like Lotus Field part of their weakness is that they don't have a lot of interaction for the first like 3 turns, and they also don't usually kill in the first 3 turns. They usually kill like turn 4, turn 5. So it's really important to use that time in the early turns to try and get ahead by casting pieces, by casting Ledger Shredder, by kind of going reckless, knowing that you're pretty safe and they can't really kill you. And then once it's like turn 4, turn 5, you try and disrupt them a little bit, and then hopefully you can either draw a Time Walk or more counters. Game 1 tends to be pretty hard because you don't have very many counter spells and you're slower at killing them. The post board, you side in a lot of counter spells. I guess I don't have that many counters in this list, so it's not a lot. And you kind of try and play like a blue-white control deck where you have like try and like leave up a wall of counter spells, and then win with Time Walk when you buy extra time. There's a couple things I would say. So the first thing I would say about the Lotus Field versus Phoenix matchup is I would look at the blue-white control deck. You can imagine when blue-white control has a bunch of Dovin's Vetoes and counter spells, and card advantage cards, to keep filling up their hand. They have a decent game plan against Lotus Field. So what Lotus Field does to combat that is they play uncounterable cards. In the past, they used to play Thought Distortion. Now they usually play more like Dragon Lord Jamoka or Sphinx of the Steel Wind. So that way, it creates this kind of interesting situation where like normally you could say maybe blue-white would be favored against Lotus, but blue-white doesn't have a lot of pressure, so Lotus is able to cast an uncounterable card and then just beat the blue-white player for leaving up all the vetoes. So this way you can understand the game plan of blue-white is actually good against Lotus. Lotus counteracts it with an uncounterable card. Now the plan is good as long as they don't cast the uncounterable card. So now you have to think, how do I deal with the uncounterable card? So it's kind of similar with Phoenix. You're good at countering their spells, but the problem usually was that in the past, if they just cast Thought Distortion, it was so backbreaking against you. Luckily, the uncounterable creatures aren't as good against you, which makes the matchup a decent amount better, I think. And Phoenix has more counterplay than blue-white against those uncounterable cards because you have a pretty fast clock. If when you're able to Time Walk, Lotus Field usually doesn't have a lot of interaction, and then you're pretty good at just pulling ahead and killing them. I would say if they have Narset's Reversal, then that could interact with your Time Walk plan. So that's why when you're talking about the matchup, you're always thinking about like I'm saying like, oh, a wall of counter spells is good against Lotus, but as soon as they have an uncounterable card, then it's not good. Or like Time Walk's really good, but as soon as they have this one like fringe card. So I would kind of frame it similar to playing a deck like Dredge and your opponent playing Rest in Peace, or playing a deck like Amulet Titan and your opponent plays Blood Moon. So like a lot of your normal plans are very good, but when they play these specific cards, they stop working. But you also have counterplay to those cards. That's basically what I would say about the matchup. So again, my main key takeaways. Usually when you play a combo, it's really important to know like when you're allowed to apply pressure and when you have to leave up mana. Usually just passing with mana up every turn is just like not a winning position. You kind of have to decide when you're going to develop yourself. Like think of when you're actually pulling ahead. Otherwise, you're just falling behind every turn. Sometimes it is correct to pass. It's always kind of a hard decision. But in general, I was definitely seeing like way too much people passing every turn, and the game plan didn't really make sense to me. And thinking about the like anti Phoenix cards they have, so like the uncounterable creatures and the Narset's Reversal, which I don't see as much, but I've seen some people cast it, and it was worth mentioning because otherwise, like if you fork Time Walk, they have so little interaction. But if they have Narset's Reversal, it's worth keeping in mind. There was one other thing I want to say. Oh yeah, like keeping a mulligan. You can be like a little bit more aggressive in the matchup. They don't have that much interaction. Like you really value having like a turn 2 Shredder or a turn 3 pieces of the puzzle. And yeah, I would say one thing. This goes a little bit into sideboarding. I think people also when they play Phoenix, they cut all the burn way too much against matchups like blue-white control and Lotus Field, and then they just lose to creatures for no reason. You can just keep in like 3 Lightning Axe. I mean, Lotus Field players. Yeah, I tend to keep in 3 Lightning Axe. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I see a lot of people, it's just like a mistake I see with Phoenix. Like they play against blue-white control and Lotus, they just cut all their creatures. And you don't like, the deck's good at drawing itself. You don't, against Lotus Field, you're not necessarily fighting about card advantage. You're fighting more about tempo, blah, blah, blah. I guess that wasn't a great way to put it. Like you're usually not that concerned about a dead card. You're usually not keeping hands that are super speculative. you're usually keeping hands that have ledger pieces, so you're not as concerned about Axe being like dead because they don't have a creature, just because you have so much like card advantage already. And the times when they do cast a creature, it's so important to remove it, and otherwise you just have no interaction. Like if they cast the Vizier with many faces, or the 3 mana dork, that card can represent 3 mana a turn. It's really important to remove it, and you're mostly fighting about over kind of like tempo, because both decks have a lot of card advantage and they're trying to resolve their big spell first. So yeah, that was my deck tech for Lotus Field.